Come join me and Father Kenneth Parsad as we lead a pilgrimage to France in April of 2027 and trace the paths of some of the greatest French saints, like St. Dominic, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bernadette, St. Joan of Arc, and more. This 11-day pilgrimage includes visits to Lisieux, Normandy, Paris, Mont Saint-Michel, Rouen, and Lourdes, where we will celebrate daily private Mass in some of the most iconic churches. Learn more at ycatholic.substack.com/pilgrimage. In 1995, a pastor by the name of Rick Warren wrote a book that would change the evangelical world. It's called The Purpose-Driven Church. It details the story of how he founded Saddleback Church in Southern California and how it went from a church plant to one of the most successful megachurches in the world. In this best-selling book, he details canvassing the neighborhood, looking for the unchurched, as well as the type of people that would fit in at Saddleback. It reads a little bit like brand marketing. Who is our audience? Where do they live? And how do we reach them? And then he proposes a 4-part plan to integrate the outsiders into the life of the church. It looks a little bit like a baseball diamond. You start off with level 1 and become a member of the Saddleback community, and gradually you go from there. And by the time you get to level 4, you are now ready to serve and help others become part of the church family. As part of this plan, Rick Warren coined a new phrase. Now, it's possible someone else coined the phrase before him, but he certainly made it famous. It's called a seeker-sensitive worship service. He proposes that churches should be sensitive to the unchurched. Therefore, don't do weird liturgy. Don't do things that people won't understand. Keep it simple. Some catchy music by a good worship team, followed by a very compelling, simple sermon focused on the gospel message and bringing people to Christ. If you're wondering what about communion, Rick Warren urged churches not to do this during the main worship service, since the main worship service is focused on the outsiders or the unchurched. It'll be weird for them. So instead, do communion at another time, maybe a Sunday night service where all the volunteers attend when they're not busy helping to serve. Rick Warren's book is considered one of the most influential books of the 20th century. I would venture to say it's probably on most Protestant pastors' shelves, and certainly it's required reading for anyone who wants to plant a church. Many have tried to implement this blueprint. In fact, I was a part of 2 churches where we tried to retroactively implement the purpose-driven church plan, and all of them eventually failed. It felt a little bit like putting a square peg into a round hole. But there have been many that have successfully implemented some or all of the purpose-driven church model. For years, I thought the purpose-driven church model and the seeker-sensitive worship service were brilliant. But after I left vocational ministry, I began looking for a church. And as I attended various churches, I found myself with an itch I could not scratch. Something was missing from the worship service, and I came to the conclusion that church really had to be more than just some music and a talk. Maybe the seeker-sensitive idea was vogue and proved in the long run to be a shallow and poor idea. As you are aware, I swung the complete opposite direction, and I became Catholic. And like most people that begin attending Mass, I was completely lost for the first month or so. Wanting to know what was going on and the meaning behind it all took curiosity and research, and maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe worship shouldn't be easy. Maybe it should take effort. And maybe it shouldn't feel familiar. Maybe there's an element of it that should feel strange because, after all, we are worshiping the God of the universe. Why should we discover a strange God in a familiar format? Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. Thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. I'm so touched by all of you that listen, who have told me that this podcast has been helpful in your own faith journeys, and especially those who have left really kind reviews. I'm wondering if you would consider doing me a huge favor. Would you consider becoming a supporter of Why Catholic and helping others hear this message of the truth, goodness, and beauty of the Catholic faith? You can do this by going to ycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. This is part 5 of our series on the Mass, which began in episode 182. We talked about reimagining the Mass, we talked about the Jewish roots of the Mass, we turned our attention to orienting ourselves to the Mass, and then we talked about the ways that Jesus shows up in Mass. And today I want to talk about the transcendence of the Mass. Specifically, I want to talk about 3 aspects of the Mass that I find to be transcendental. By that, I mean that Mass rises above the ordinary. To begin, let's explore how the Mass transcends our individuality. When I was a pastor, there was this really awesome young family that came to visit one Sunday. We were a fairly small church, maybe 50 to 75 people, so new families were noticeable. Everyone got excited that this family might be a new addition to our church, and then we didn't see them afterwards. Maybe a month or so later, I got a call from the wife, and she said that they had visited lots of churches, and they wanted to let me know that our church won. I've never been told that our church won as though we were in some sort of dating contest, but that's the reality in the Protestant world, particularly in low churches like Baptist or non-denominational. People look for a church that suits them. It matches with their theology. They like listening to the preacher. The music style fits them. It's very much inward focused. It's focused on me and what I like. And as a result, churches are fairly homogenous. It's pretty rare that you'll find a multicultural, non-denominational, or evangelical church. Martin Luther King Jr. famously said that 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America, and not much has changed since he said that in 1960. There's white churches and black churches and Latino churches and churches with this particular style and that particular style. And what I found as I was exploring Protestant churches was that I was often choosing churches where everyone looked like me, white, middle class. When I began deconstructing church and really wrestling with what church is supposed to be, one of the things that I really desired was a church that put Jesus at the center rather than the pastor. Now, just about every pastor will tell you that they do not want to be at the center of the church. They'll adamantly say that Jesus is the center of their church. But in reality, there is a cult of personality. I remember driving through Southern California with a good friend of mine who is a Protestant pastor, and we'd point out all of these mega churches off the freeway. That's so-and-so's church, he'd say. A few minutes later, he'd point out another church. That's so-and-so's church. The church was not identified with how it elevated Jesus, or even its doctrine, but its pastor. I think if we're being really honest and discerning, we would admit that there's a cult of personality that drives attendance at many of these successful churches. Catholic churches aren't immune to that cult of personality, but there are limits to how far it can reach. One big part of that is that priests get moved around the diocese every number of years. There's also room for style in the Mass. The priests and deacons give homilies, and each of them bring their own personality, tone, and passion. The way the priest conducts the liturgy has an element of style, even within the confines of the missal. The type of music brings with it a particular style, but the core of the Mass is not the style, but the content, and at the center of the content of the Mass is the Holy Eucharist, where the bread and wine become the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. Whenever I'm visiting friends or family members, I will always go to Mass, and afterwards they'll say to me, "How was Mass?" And my response is usually, "It was Mass." There may be memorable elements of the Mass, but in a sense, the style gets lost in the content. What really matters, the center of it all, is that our Lord Jesus shows up at the Mass. In becoming Catholic, there was a loss of control. I chose the Mass rather than choosing a worship style that was more like me and my tastes. If you think about it, this is the foundation of the Christian church. In ancient Judaism, when a student wanted to follow a rabbi, he would choose a rabbi that he had in mind. And it would become kind of an audition where the student would ask, "Can I follow you?" And the rabbi would test him to see if he was worthy. But in Jesus' case, what was so unique was that the rabbi invited the disciples. He didn't give them a test to see if they were worthy. They weren't. They were tradesmen for the most part. Most of them were fishermen. They were likely tradesmen because they didn't have what it took to pass all the schooling needed to become a student of a rabbi and eventually a rabbi themselves. Yet Jesus still told them, "Follow me." And while all of Jesus' inner 12 were Jews, they certainly weren't a monolith. You had Matthew, who worked for the Roman government as a tax collector, alongside of Simon the Zealot. Zealots, by the way, sought to overthrow the government. Boy, I would have loved to be a fly on the wall around their campfire. I'm sure there were some very lively discussions. When Christianity grew, one of its early challenges was that its churches were made up of Jews and Gentiles. I don't think we can appreciate just how stark of a challenge this posed. Jews never associated with Gentiles, let alone worshipped with them. So all of a sudden, within the paradigm of Christianity, Jews and Gentiles were thrusted into the same space, worshiping the same God. What is it that brought them together? It was the Mass. The Mass became not just their common liturgy, it became their common language, common culture, and common theology. We see this clearly in 1 Corinthians chapters 10 and 11, where Paul chastises the church at Corinth for the disparity in the practice of Holy Communion. They were figuring out what it meant to have this common theology and practice this common liturgy, and Paul reminds them that it also becomes a common language. He says, "For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until you come again." The Mass transcends our individuality, and in doing so, it creates and fosters greater unity. We trade what suits us best for what brings us closer to each other. In the church at Corinth, Paul chastises them because some of them were eating all of the bread and drinking all of the wine while others had nothing. Some were putting themselves above others. When we practice the Mass appropriately with understanding and reverence, our own interests become eclipsed by the interests of others. One of the things that I sometimes try and do when I am at Mass is that I like to sit towards the front, and that means that I receive communion before a lot of the other parishioners. So when I go back to my seat and I'm kneeling as communion is still going on, I try and pray for each person that is receiving communion. I don't always do this, but I try and make it a habit. And in doing so, I'm reminded that communion isn't just about me and Jesus. It is about the whole community. Speaking of which, a second aspect in which Mass is transcendental is that it transcends our time and space. I've shared this quote a number of times in this podcast. It comes from Leon Wesseltier, longtime literary editor of the prestigious magazine The New Republic and an observant Jew, who notes this about Jewish liturgy, quote, "In the age of tradition, the past was present. It was one of the primary purposes of Jewish ritual and liturgy to abolish time, to make Jews divided by history into contemporaries and those divided by geography into neighbors. In this way, the many communities of Judaism were unified into a single people and the experiences of many Jews into a single story," end quote. Just like Jewish liturgy, Christian liturgy, which is Jewish in origin, is meant to break down barriers. This is completely opposite from my experience in Protestant evangelicalism. Worship there was always a unique factor. Come check out our worship team, check out our pastor's sermons, see how we do worship differently. In Catholicism, as well as other Christian traditions, liturgy isn't what makes us unique, but what we share in common. It's what makes us a community. And not just a community within the walls of a particular church, but something we share with churches around the world. We have a shared calendar that involves celebrations like solemnities, feast days, and seasons of fasting. We share the same reading, so no matter if you're in France or Brazil or Australia, you're reading the same Bible passages. Even the Liturgy of the Hours, the official prayer of the church, is a shared liturgy. Every day at every hour, because of the different time zones, the same prayers are being offered up to heaven. The Mass doesn't just transcend our moment here on earth either, but it also extends beyond time and space. When we sing the Holy, 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 we are, as the priest explains, joining all the angels and the saints. It's not a looking forward to some future event in heaven. That event is going on now. It's eternal, and the Mass is the portal into that eternal moment. So when we sing Holy, 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 we are joining the saints and angels in participating in eternity. As I mentioned earlier in this series, when we participate in Mass, we are not re-sacrificing Jesus, but rather we are joining the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mary Magdalene, and St. John the Evangelist at the foot of the cross. The crucifixion is an eternal moment, and the Mass is how we enter into that eternity. The saints, whether they be the original followers of Jesus, the early church fathers, or more recent saints, are not just Christians of a bygone era. They become our contemporaries. Those Christians separated by space become our neighbors. Mass is the mechanism in which we experience the communion of saints. Not only does Mass transcend our individuality as well as our time and space, it also transcends our familiarity. I have a lot of respect for Rick Warren. In the age of mega churches and celebrity pastors, I've always found him to be humble and Christ-like. But I think his idea of a seeker-sensitive worship service is the opposite of what worship should be. God is not like us. In Isaiah 55, he reminds us, quote, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts," end quote. And yes, while Jesus became like us in the form of a man, he lived life radically different than us. And so it would seem to make sense that the way we approach God isn't with something that is familiar to us, but rather something foreign to us. If we associate familiarity in our secular world with God, well, it becomes easy to imagine a God that looks like our secular world. If God is otherworldly, then that should be reflected in our worship. It should be otherworldly. It should transcend what we find to be commonplace and familiar in this world. Let me give you an example using language and culture. I am bilingual. English is my first language, and Spanish is a language that I learned in high school and college. I studied abroad in Spain. One of the things I realized when I was studying abroad is that when I would write to friends or family back home and explain an event I went to, it was really challenging to find the words in English. It's like the English word did not fit with the Spanish experience. That is because, as anthropologists and sociologists will tell you, language and culture are inseparable. Furthermore, I notice that I have a different personality when I'm around Latinos and speaking Spanish. I'm usually a pretty shy individual, but when I'm with Latinos, I become much more of an extrovert. This has been confirmed by psychologists who recognize that we actually take on different personalities when we're speaking another language. This is similar to the Mass. Mass isn't just something we do, it's a way of life, it's a culture, it's a language. And so when we speak the language of Mass, when we enter into the Mass, it should not reflect our secular world as though we're trying to mimic a rock concert. Rather, it should be its own unique experience. I want to end this episode by addressing something in the Roman rite of the Catholic Church, and that is the Latin Mass. At the time of this recording, the big news in the Catholic Church is the excommunication of the SSPX, or the Society of St. Pius X. The SSPX is a hyper-traditional Catholic organization that has been in conflict with the Vatican since its inception, mainly for their protests of the Second Vatican Council and the authority of the Pope. One thing they are passionate about, which I totally understand, is the traditional Latin Mass. And they're not the only ones. There are other groups in communion with the Pope in Rome that uphold the traditional Latin Mass. I don't often go to Latin Mass, maybe a handful of times a year, but it's not because I don't like it or I don't prefer it. It's because I'm busy with my responsibilities at my parish with our typical English Masses. I can't say that I prefer the Latin Mass over the Novus Ordo, but what I can say is that I think we lost two things when the Church adopted the Novus Ordo. First, I think we may have traded the transcendental for the familiar. And I understand that. I think it's reasonable to an extent. I think it's good to want to ensure that people understand what's going on. However, what I find so interesting is that I often hear former Catholics who grew up with the Novus Ordo say, I had no idea what was happening in Mass. So I don't think that the Novus Ordo solved the problem that church leaders perceived to be the problem with the Latin Mass. Just as I disagree with the approach of the seeker-sensitive service, familiarity isn't what creates understanding. Catechesis is. I think there's something so good and right about a type of liturgy and worship that brings people to ask questions. People don't leave because it's unfamiliar to them. They leave because they lack curiosity and effort. I think the other thing that has been lost with the Novus Ordo is the shared language of the Mass. I've had a few occasions where I've spoken with somebody, and because neither of us speak each other's primary language, we end up speaking Spanish together. It's our shared second language. The Latin Mass was a shared language. It was nobody's primary language, but in a sense, it became everyone's liturgical language. And because of that, there was no English Mass or Spanish Mass. Now, I don't know how common it is in other countries to have different masses and parishes based on languages, but here in the United States, it's fairly common. Our parish has an Anglo community and a Spanish community, and unfortunately, they remain fairly separate. And having masses in the vernacular reinforces that segregation. Now, I'm not naive. I think even if we were to have a Latin Mass, you would still see people segregate based on their language and culture. I'm someone with a lot of cultural sensitivity. I'm someone who cares very deeply for minority populations like the Black community or the Hispanic community. And I think that one way that we foster that empathy for the other is through community. And so if we have segregation in Catholic parishes, we lose that opportunity for greater community and greater understanding and greater empathy. But with all that said, even though Mass is said by and large in the vernacular around the world, Mass is still its own language. A few years ago, when I was in Barcelona, I attended Mass in the crypt of the Sagrada Familia. Because it was in Barcelona, Mass was in Catalan, not in Spanish. And I participated all the same, only I participated in English. And what I so appreciate about Mass is that I can go anywhere around the world to another Catholic church and participate in the Mass, not because Mass is familiar, as much as it is transcendental. Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.